Tonight we want to unroll nautical charts or chase the ghosts of sailors who swore they saw land where none should be. Instead, we'll drift west of Ireland, into waters where the horizon blurs so completely that the sea seems to invent its own geography. Out here, fog is not just weather. It is an author, drawing and erasing coastlines with a patience older than ink. For centuries, cartographers inked a perfect circle onto their maps, an island divided neatly in two, as if geometry itself had risen from the waves. They named it Hy-Brasil, and the name lingered like a rumor you could almost touch. Sailors told stories of towers, of cattle grazing on green meadows, of a land that appeared and disappeared at its own discretion, never in a hurry to be found. So lower the lights. Let the weight of salt air and sea mist press gently against you. And if your breathing begins to match the steady rhythm of waves that hide more than they reveal, that's just the ocean carrying you into its own kind of dream. And as the fog thickens in your imagination, the circle on those old sea charts begins to sharpen, as if the ink itself is tugging you closer. Sailors leaned over damp parchment by lantern light, tracing and retracing that perfect round mark, wondering if tomorrow's tide would carry them to its hidden shores or past them into nothing but more gray water. Perhaps that's where we should begin, with the maps themselves, where a phantom island waited patiently for centuries, inked into existence by the steady hands of cartographers who trusted rumor as much as compass. West of Ireland, somewhere between the gulls and the larger gulls, cartographers in the 14th and 15th centuries drew a neat round island with a line through the middle, like a coin with a hairline crack. The placement drifted about from chart to chart as if the island itself was shy, but the shape hardly changed, and the name lingered in graceful letters. Hy-Brasil, or sometimes Hy-Brasil, as if it had a surname and a family you could visit on Sundays. Medieval mapmakers copied, they embellished, they added small red castles, and then they went to bed. These were the Portolan chart makers, patient people with rulers, compasses, and the unshakable belief that coastlines behave when measured with string. They loved rum lines that spread like a spider web, and they loved islands because islands were opportunities for labels, and labels were opportunities for flourishing ink. On some charts, Hy-Brasil sits as a perfectly round biscuit west of Galway, separated by a channel as thin as a fingernail. On others, it drifts farther into the Atlantic until it looks like a sun setting under the edge of the parchment. No volcanoes are drawn, no rivers, just the line across its middle like a road or a reminder to fold your laundry. A monk in a scriptorium would have seen it and nodded as if it explained everything. A pilot at sea would have seen it and nodded, because nodding is what you do when the boss asks if you know where you are. Sailors said they saw it. That is the essential drowsy fact. They saw a dark mass, then a pale shore, then almost theatrically it faded back into mist. One captain described approaching it and hearing seabirds that he could not see and smelling peat smoke that might have been his galley. Another swore that at sunset, the island showed windows lit with gold, a village whose chimneys sent up threads of evening. Every tale contains a sensible, bureaucratic detail. As if the island possessed a harbor master, the water was 17 fathoms. The bottom was sandy. A shoal lay to the north. You can feel the logbook pressing down on the myth. Meet lines of soundings trying to tame a place that did not want to be charted. The sea is a talented magician, and sailors are polite audience members. They clap, they tell the next port what they saw, and they promise to come back with a friend. In Irish stories, the island was not merely present. It was purposeful. It was the island of eternal knowledge, which sounds like a library that forgets to close. Wise men live there in some versions, and a single king in others, and in all of them the island practices a very modern policy on visitors. Limited access, unclear hours, no guarantee of entry, please try again after the fog. A few tailies say that every 7 years the veil lifts, as if Hy-Brasil had a calendar app with a recurring event. You could catch sighted cattle that never grew, old orchards that never dropped their fruit, and a path that always led you home. At least as soon as you realized that home was something you remembered and not something you could dock beside. This is the sort of geography you get when a culture stares westward at a horizon with nothing beyond it but weather and hears gossip from fishermen who enjoy adding a pinch of legend to their nets. There's a slippery bridge here to the Celtic otherworld, the places where fairies live not in tiny houses but in normal-sized landscapes that happen to be behind a curtain. The other world is often adjacent, which is a wonderfully economical choice. It keeps property values sensible and travel time minimal. Hy-Brasil behaved like one of these neighbors with special zoning. Not frightening, just inconvenient. It showed itself to people who were already tired from handling ropes, then asked them to be very careful with what they saw, and then it disposed of the evidence by means of mist. In a way, the island performed bedtime stories for adults. It promised instruction and gentle wonder, and it put a boundary around the whole experience so no one had to actually change their route. The ocean does not need more errands. It has waves to maintain. The scientific temperament arrives on soft shoes and carries lenses. When natural philosophers, and later the more specialized skeptics, examined Hy-Brasil, they found a shelf of explanations that were neither hostile nor excited, simply dutiful. First came mirage. Over cold water, warm air forms a duct, and distant objects invert or elongate. The effect is grandly named Fata Morgana, as if the sea hired a stage illusionist. A low bank can rise like a city. A cloud line can sharpen into a parapet. With the right temperature inversion, a ship turns into a cliff, and a cliff into an island divided by a streak of shadow that looks remarkably like a river. If you are half a day out from Bantry Bay and someone points and says island, you are not inclined to argue. Seamen are brave with storms, less so with other people's pointing. Then came the simpler prospect, error. Copying a chart is like copying homework, except the homework is your only way to avoid rocks. If one source shows a neat circular island, another will repeat it, and soon a third will add a decorative notch, because decoration implies confidence. The circle with the dividing line may have begun as a drafting convention, a way to signify an island reported but not confirmed, and then developed a life similar to a small office myth about the correct setting for the photocopier. You set it to two-sided once in 1470, and it is still two-sided in 1560, and by then everyone assumes there is a policy. Even the measured leads and soundings can join the legend. You can sound 17 fathoms almost anywhere if you really want to, especially if your rope reads in fathoms that have experienced a decade of salt and shrinking. There are more solid nominees. Off Ireland lie banks and rises, such as the Porcupine Bank, that barely graze the surface and then decline. With a long swell and a patient eye, a bank can become a shoreline. In heavy haze, a line of dark kelp can impersonate a beach with the confidence of an understudy finally called the stage. Rockall, lonely and stern to the north, occasionally recruits a low cloud to sit over it like a hat, creating the silhouette of a far larger mass. A navigator in 1680 might not split hairs between which precise rock performed the magic. He saw land, he logged a land, and if tomorrow that land had responsible plans elsewhere, it was not necessarily his fault or even his interest. He had a crew to feed and a sail to dry and a barrel to complain about. The disappearance of Hy-Brasil from maps looks dramatic on a slideshow, but felt quiet at the time. As charts became the property of hydrographic offices rather than workshop families, the criteria for what counted as land tightened like a new belt. Repeated soundings mattered. Sightings converging from different ships mattered. An island that behaved like a visiting lecturer, charming but unavailable, earned fewer invitations. The 19th century preferred rational clutter to poetic clarity. Lighthouses with accurate pulses, foghorns with measured complaints, careful notes on magnetic variation. A circle with a line through it began to look like an unnecessary ornament, a cufflink for a sleeve that had gone plain. Some editions kept the ghost as a dotted suspicion called Brazil Rock, because it is difficult for bureaucracy to say goodbye without leaving a forwarding address. Why it vanished, then, is as simple as paperwork and as complicated as human expectation. New instruments, better timekeeping chronometers that behaved if you bribed them with attention, and lemon juice satellites. Later on, that never once misreported a fairy city-o. All of this makes the sea legible in a way the old maps did not need. But there is also appetite. The people who bought charts wanted certainty. They wanted coastlines that fit the numbers and harbors that kept their shape through winter. An island that liked the 7-year plan did not suit new schedules. Imagine trying to assign a lighthouse crew to a place that appears every 7th summer. Wonderful for morale, impossible for budgeting. The Admiralty, like everyone else, dislikes suspense. Now, what if it was real, in some conditional way that satisfies neither scientists nor spirits, but helps you fall asleep? Suppose there is a shelf west of Ireland that rises higher in certain tidal cycles, just high enough to set the sea differently, so that when the sun clears a bank of haze, the whole sheet of water behaves as if it has edges. You would see shape where there is only slope, a harbor where there is only quiet. Or suppose there was once a low volcanic mound that shrugged off its top in some forgotten storm. It would have been a poor island, the sort you forget while you are still standing on it, but it could have started the story. Or suppose the island is strictly literary and thus perfectly real in its assigned realm, a place invented to place something else, a pin you stick into the margin of the unknown to keep the paper from flapping. To a cartographer, stability. To a sailor, a hope that there might be somewhere to stop for a new rope, and a gossip about the weather. If quiet voyages like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next phantom island rising through the fog will be waiting for you there. The other possibility is more domestic. Hy-Brasil could be what happens when communities formalize the wish for a rest, a break in the fog, a shore that is not obliged to be there every day. There is kindness in an island that cannot be overfished because it cannot be found. Wisdom in a library that opens only when no one is in a hurry. The circle on the map, the clean bisecting line, is an invitation to draw breath. Even the name performs a soft trick. It echoes distant places while being firmly Irish in tone, cosmopolitan and local at once. Like a pub that serves a soup you could swear is French, but insists it is just soup. And so Hy-Brasil teaches its gentle lesson by doing very little. It appears, then thinks better of it. It sits on maps, then goes out for a walk and forgets to return. It gives the scientific mind something to practice on, the folkloric mind something to perch on, and the sleepy mind a subject that never accelerates. You can picture a pilot in a wool cap, watching the horizon and telling his mate that if an island wanted to be found, it would fill out the paperwork. You can picture a monk with a goose feather quill, adding a round island to a round ocean with round rules, then blowing on the ink and listening to the wind through the cloister. You can picture yourself now, rolling the word Hy-Brasil in your mouth like a small lozenge of geography. A taste of West, not very sweet, steadily soothing, dissolving at the same pace as attention does. Tonight the sea is flatter than it needs to be. The charts are older than they admit, and the candles along the bench throw the kind of light that was invented for quiet mistakes. Somewhere past the Skelligs, a bank lifts the water just enough to pretend at a beach. Somewhere a gull believes it has seen a cow. On shore, a map waits with an empty circle where a story can sit until someone decides to retell it. And if you are still listening, you might notice that the island has already done its work. which is to be present just long enough to let the mind loosen its rope and drift. A small boat trusting the line of a horizon that, like Hy-Brasil, is always there and never needs to prove it. You might not expect a neat little circle on a medieval sea chart to keep appearing and disappearing like a shy coin under a sleeve, but there it is, and there it goes. Hy-Brasil, the island that makes cartographers sound like poets clearing their throats. West of Ireland, on maps with long Latin titles and patient compass roses, someone carefully inked a round island, often split by a straight line as if the island had politely agreed to be folded. The line looks strangely administrative, like a border drawn by a bureaucrat who never visited. And the circle itself feels confident in an unhurried way, the way a kettle hums before it boils. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe for more circles that might or might not exist, though, honestly, don't strain. Medieval mapmakers certainly didn't. They copied what pleased them, embellished what puzzled them, and then went home before the candles misbehaved. The people who made those nautical charts favored rulers, compasses, and the soothing repetition of rum lines that cross like a deliberate spiderweb. In their world, the coastline of Ireland, solid and green in memory, needed a chorus of support, promontories labeled in tiny letters, capes that wore names like small hats, soundings written as calm numbers that looked like polite coughs. And beyond that, to the west, the parchment felt empty unless it contained something round. Hy-Brasil filled that space with a miniature bravado. On some charts it lies close to Galway Bay, a biscuit placed near a saucer. On others it drifts outward like a sleepy thought. The island rarely sprouts a mountain or a river. It is content to be itself, a circle with the faint suggestion of a road. If you have ever drawn a map to your friend's house and added a tree that may not actually exist, you have done early cartography a small favor. Sailors confirmed the habit by saying the island was real. Of course they did. The sea rewards conviction, and besides, reporting an island earns you an instant upgrade in any portside story circle. Accounts mention a low, dark shore rising from a morning fog, the smell of peat where no boat showed smoke, the sudden shine of what looked under a bruised sunset like the windows of a village. Some captains even offered practical data, as if Hy-Brasil had a clerk. Water at 17 fathoms, bottom sandy. A shoal to the north. Birds congregating as if they had freeloading cousins on land. It's comforting to imagine those logbooks, the tidy columns anchoring a legend that barely wanted anchoring. This is how myths behave when they grow up among professionals. They keep one foot inside the ledger. The stories travel farther back and grow softer at the edges. In Irish tradition, there is a place sometimes called the Land of Eternal Knowledge. You reach it if you are lucky or well-timed, or both two qualities the sea mistakes for each other. Time behaves generously there. Cows are still cows, but they wear the years like light coats in summer. Apples pause in their ripening because nobody has decided its harvest yet. The island is not a paradise exactly. It's more like a well-run library where the lending periods are kindly. You're permitted to know things without hurry. If you feel a gentle breeze in this sentence, it is the librarian turning a page. People come back from that island in the stories, and when they do, they look as if they have been given a long weekend for the soul. Linking Hy-Brasil to the Celtic otherworld is almost unavoidable, the way tea gravitates toward a biscuit. The otherworld in these tales is not distant. It is adjacent, with excellent public transport in the form of mist music and coincidences. Fairies do not live in thimble houses, but in normal-sized geography that declines to make appointments. Sometimes the veil lifts every 7 years. Sometimes it lifts for people who are already looking thoughtfully at waves. Occasionally it lifts for fishermen who have packed unusually good bread. Hy-Brasil behaves as if it has read the policy manual, visitors allowed, souvenirs discouraged. Please leave everything as you found it, including yourself. In a way, the island is the maritime version of a do not disturb sign. it tells you that wonder is available, but only if you are content to describe it badly upon return. Eventually, the habit of explanation shows up, slightly out of breath and carrying a notebook. The sea, people explain, is fond of mirages. Warm air over cooler water forms a duct that bends light like a polite elbow, elevating distant objects into layered images with crisp tops and melted bottoms. Navigator's folklore gives this phenomenon a theatrical name, Fata Morgana, which makes you imagine a stage assistant in a silver cloak pulling an island out of a horizon like a ribbon from a sleeve. A low bank becomes a bleached cliff. Rockall, lonely and vertical to the north, turns into something grander. A cloud's shadow lies across the mirage, a neat, improbable line that looks like a river dividing a circle. And if your vessel is far enough from home, and the day has been long enough with rope and salt, an Oasian becomes a welcome visitor, especially one rumored to hand out eternal knowledge between squalls. There is also the theory of copying error, which is less romantic and very persuasive to anyone who has ever duplicated a form and preserved the original typo because it felt historical. Cartographers relied on older charts, pilots' reports, and draftsmen's habits. A circle with a dividing line may have begun as a symbol for reported but not verified, the antiquarian equivalent of a sticky note with a question mark. But symbols have charisma. The next chart keeps the circle because symbols offer confidence, and the one after that adds a faint hatch or a label in brave red ink. Before long, the island is part of the quiet furniture of the page. Once anything becomes furniture, people bump into it and remember it better. In the same spirit, the measurements in pilot books, fathoms, bearings, bottom types are obedient servants who will stand next to any idea and make it look hireable. Other sober explanations line up. Submerged banks off Ireland, like the Porcupine Bank, lurk just beneath the waves, lifting the water into plains that photograph as land in the mind. Kelp beds gather and darken the surface like large, gentle crowds. The Atlantic keeps a rolling set of swells that, from a distance, bring up the profile of a fake coastline that recedes as politely as it arrived. If you want to be unromantic, you can also say that the island's position on maps drifts almost exactly as an era would drift. Inherited, adjusted, lovingly maintained, but even this has its own slow comfort. We are watching the mind of Europe practice at not knowing something and be very neat about it. There is kindness in that picture, a community saying, "We will hold your place until you arrive, and if you don't, the chair is still a chair." Now comes the section that sounds like intrigue but mostly smells of ink and new rulers. Why Hy-Brasil vanished from maps. The 19th century, crisp as a starched shirt, disliked doodles on navigation. Hydrographic offices replaced family workshops. Surveys became bureaucratically thorough. Ships carried chronometers that were fussy about lemon juice but faithful about time. The new Atlases tidied their margins. Doubt was still permitted, but it needed a permit. An island you could not approach with a sextant and a ledger had to downgrade itself to rumor rock, then dotted outline, then silence. The lighthouse people were practical. You cannot schedule a lightkeeper on a 7-year roster and ask him to bring his own fog. If a shape would not sit still long enough to receive a longitude, it would not earn a light. People who had once penciled salt-shaded castles on parchment now preferred a slim symbol for a buoy that actually existed. Was there a conspiracy to erase, or only a consensus to clean? Conspiracy is such a lively word for such a sleepy process. In truth, disappearance feels like a filing decision. The pages thickened with verified coasts, and the patient little circle, repeatedly unvisited, lost its chair. Yet even here the story preserves a whisper of mischief. A few charts kept Brazil rock for a while, as if bureaucracy could not bear an abrupt goodbye. Government agencies are sentimental in their own way. They will escort a legend to the door with a faint, drafty courtesy, and then keep the coat for 7 more winters, just in case. But the question remains, what if it was, in some sense, agreeable to bedtime real? Perhaps a low volcanic hump waved once from the Atlantic and then sulked back under a storm, leaving rumors like footprints in a book. Perhaps rare tidal stacks and fogs conspire on some slow schedule to manufacture a convincing shore for an hour, a thought experiment for tired pilots with ink on their thumbs. Or perhaps the island's reality was always human. It gathered the longings of crews who wanted a noon that lasted. It condensed the gossip of coasts. It offered the imagination a resting place equidistant from past and future. When something in your life is absent yet precisely shaped, it behaves like Hy-Brasil. You keep a chair for it anyway. Stories of the land of eternal knowledge suggest another possibility that has nothing to do with plate tectonics and everything to do with politeness. The island could exist as a permission slip to slow down thought. On Hy-Brasil, decisions do not expire. Questions ripen at a leisurely pace. You can be eloquent in silence. Irish storytellers who understand the economy of the pause might nod at this as if agreeing with themselves. A fisherman hearing such a tale at the fire could say, without removing his cap, that the island sounds like a good neighbor quiet, keeps to itself, never needs a ladder. There is also the neighborly business of the other world's doorway, the loan of sight, the sudden chime in the air when fog thins just so. A superstition can be seen as a maintenance plan for wonder. Oil the hinge occasionally, do not slam the door, and let nobody paint it shut. Hy-Brasil's 7-year schedule, with its coy appearances, is oddly reasonable. It keeps the legend from getting worn out by daily traffic. If you have ever chosen to visit a favorite cafe only once a month, so it continues to feel like a treat, you have already grasped the island's operations manual. Meanwhile, the scientific lens can be turned down to a gentler brightness. Fata Morgana is less a debunking than a compliment. It admits the sea's sense of theater. Optical ducts roll like carpeted corridors between layers of air. Light does what any conscientious traveler does and follows the path of least resistance. Even in heavy languages like trigonometry, the explanation feels cozy. Angles, layers, refractive indices, all fussing together like knitters deciding which stitch to use. The outcome is a city that rises, a beach that pauses mid-wave, an island that waits for you just beyond calculation. It is entirely possible to understand the mechanism and still wave to the apparition as if it were an old friend who prefers not to chat. When charts abandoned the circle, they did not remove the need it met. The western horizon stayed large and unpunctuated. The Atlantic continued to present an admirable amount of nothing, and sailors remained human, which is to say, slightly bored between interesting things. So Hy-Brasil survives in the comfortable corners of memory and in footnotes that no one resents. It shows up in pub conversations at the unhurried hour when the second round puts elbows on tables and stories almost simmer. It visits academic articles like a polite cat, sits on the reference list for warmth, and then wanders away. Even skeptical historians who keep their tea separate from their biscuits sometimes admit the charm of a map with a circle that declines to explain itself. And if you picture that map now, the paper gently curled at the edges, you might notice that the circle and its bisecting line are excellent sleeping aids. A simple shape, divided evenly, containing nothing but suggestive of everything. It is hard to be anxious while looking at geometry that has decided to be kind. You can imagine the chart maker, elbows on the desk, resting his hand after the last flourish, feeling for a moment that the ocean has been persuaded into cooperating. You can imagine the sailor later, tracing that circle with a fingernail as the ship keeps a soft, creaking conversation with the night. You can imagine yourself tracing it too, not to locate anything, but to occupy the mind with something round and reasonable. If, in some impossibly clear dawn, the island did rise ahead, you would not need many words. You would do what sailors always do when patience finally looks like land, reduce the sail a little, Confirm the soundings. Instruct the cook not to overexcite the stew. You would watch how the light behaves. You would notice whether birds commit to it or only pretend. You would measure the gap between what you hope to see and what the water offers, and then decide that measurement can wait. Most likely, like everyone else before you would drift past and let the island decide whether to finish the performance. It is a peaceful trick, letting a place be present only as much as attention allows. Hy-Brasil becomes a rehearsal for sleep. You place it on the horizon. You mark it with a neat circle. You draw a line so the mind knows where to fold. You describe it to yourself with unconvincing confidence. And then, before proof can arrive, you let the mist do what mist has always done best. Perhaps that is why the legend keeps the word knowledge inside it. Not the noisy sort, the kind that brings trumpets and footnotes, but the quiet kind that sits by the fire at the end of a weathered day. Content to know that it does not need to know more. The island was seen. The island was not seen. The sea maintained its excellent record of being the sea. And you, untidy but forgiven, can loosen your grip on the railing, let the chart roll itself closed, and listen to the slow slap of waves practicing their lines for tomorrow. You might not expect a perfectly round dot with a tidy line through the middle to cause centuries of discussion about something that may never have existed. But such is the soothing power of old sea charts. There, west of Ireland, the ink settles into a little circle, sometimes shaded like a half-closed eye, sometimes bisected as if the island had agreed to be folded for convenient storage. Cartographers who loved instruments that behaved gave it a name that whispered rather than shouted, Hy-Brasil, or sometimes just Brasil, as if the island preferred to arrive on a first-name basis. If you're still awake by the time we get to optical ducts and refractive indices, you're welcome to subscribe for a more gentle geography that refuses to hurry, though. Truly don't strain yourself. The people who drew these maps certainly didn't. They worked by candlelight, by memory, by rumor printed in neat italic, and by that oldest method of all, copying what looked correct because it looked correct yesterday. One of the comforts of those charts is their sense of order. Compass roses bloom like quiet flowers. Rum lines run across the page in patient diagonals, a net for catching possibility. Ireland sits like a green loaf, and beside it the Atlantic expands with the kind of empty space that makes a pen nervous. You can almost feel a mapmaker's hand pausing over that plain expanse, the quill tip thinking its own thoughts before laying down a circle so clean it could pass for a coin. The circle is often split by a straight line, like a button with an obliging seam, and now the page looks balanced. A margin note might explain the island in 4 words, or none. Sometimes a tiny road appears, as though the island had invented infrastructure long before residents. It is an island of manners. It shows up on time, holds still, and never asks for mountains. Sailors gave the dot a reputation. A dark smudge rising from morning fog. Low hills behind a curtain of rain. The honey smell of peat fires where no map admitted a cottage. These are the kinds of details that daylight always makes sound exaggerated, and that the galley as steam makes taste right. In logbooks, you find the comfortable mixture of numbers and hunches. 17 fathoms, sandy bottom. Birds plentiful. An appearance of land. The phrase, an appearance of land, is so carefully non-committal that it could balance a cup on its head. Yet the more such lines accumulate, the more an island seems like a professional courtesy. The sea produces phenomena. Sailors produce sentences about phenomena. Maps collect the sentences and draw circles to think them. The people at home knew a parallel tale. Irish tradition sketches an island where time forgets to bruise fruit. It is not heaven more like a well-run county with excellent weather and relaxed paperwork. Knowledge lives there not as a trophy, but as a neighbor, always around, rarely loud. Cattle graze as if they have signed a calm agreement with grass. The bees mind their business. Music occurs without a performer claiming responsibility. Travelers return changed only in the subtle ways, the kind of differences that make their neighbors say, "You seem rested," and then pass the butter. In a world of storms and tax days, the existence of a place like that is a tidy thought to tuck into a pocket. The other world is not far. It behaves like next door, except that the door is made of weather. Mist does the errands. Sometimes every 7 years, because 7 is a kindly number, the island lifts its hat and shows a shoreline to anyone paying attention. At other times, it visits under the legal cover of coincidence. A wind drop here, a flick of sun there, the exact height of a wave giving mirror space to a horizon. If you have ever seen a neighborhood cat appear only when the kettle boils, you understand the scheduling policy. Hy-Brasil is a good guest in the human mind. It does not stay long enough to require laundry. It sends no bells. Of course, explanations eventually arrive, wearing spectacles and carrying a ruler that can be folded into eighths. The Atlantic, faithful and complicated, plays a magic lantern show with layers of air. A warm layer rests over a cooler one, light bends. Distant headlands, or lonely rocks, or even the edge of the sky itself, are lifted and stretched into dignified imposters. Mariners call this Fata Morgana as if a stage manager named Morgan were responsible. In the theater of the horizon, cliffs rise and kneel, bays publish themselves, and the line between real and plausible develops the charming hesitation of a well-read librarian. Seen through such a duct of air, a single rock can emerge until it acquires the precise confidence of an island, complete with a suspiciously straight river that is really a shadow sliced by the effect as geometry. There is also the copy and paste theory, or as archivists call it, tradition. A symbol placed on one chart for reported but unverified becomes, on the next, customary. The third chart promotes it, not out of malice, but because empty paper is a lonely thing and the circle has by now achieved seniority. The bisecting line may once have meant uncertain, or seen in fog, or the medieval equivalent of your cartographic mileage may vary, yet lines are persuasive. Soon they are merely a design choice. This is how office coffee mugs become official policy. Put them on enough desks and they start attending meetings. Other sober raisins cue politely. Banks such as the porcupine rise beneath the surface and teach the water to impersonate land. Kelp rafts gather like dark villages. A particular arrangement of swell and sun makes a cliff out of nothing more than repetition. Birds congregate over a front of life in the water and, from a distance, appear to be inspecting a coastline. And yet, in all of this conscientious unromancing, the island keeps a small dignity. To doubt a thing thoroughly is to commit it to memory. By the time hydrographers declared the circle unnecessary, it had already become the kind of absence people could locate with surprising accuracy. 19th century cartography disliked unnecessary decorations in the way. Some people dislike an extra cushion on the chair they have already sat on. Hydrographic offices produce survey sheets precise enough to make the ocean feel criticized. Chronometers ticked with the serene self-confidence of objects that know what time it is. Triangulation marched across headlands with a pencil behind its ear. In such company, a floating roundel labeled Brazil looked like a romantic doodle. It retreated first to dotted outline, then to the polite afterlife of footnotes, and finally to the oral tradition where paperwork cannot follow. Lighthouse authorities posed practical questions. On which promontory should we put the light if the promontory can't decide to show up? Who will serve as keeper on the 7-year schedule? What is the lemon juice requirement for a metaphysical posting? If you want intrigue, you can ask whether someone decided the myth was unhelpful and quietly tidied it away. Conspiracy is a lively word, though it mostly smells of new ink. The more likely story is that a community of precise people simply agreed to be precise together. An island that will not tell you its longitude is from a bureaucratic perspective, a discourteous island. There were still a few transitional names: Brazil Rock, the Bank of Brazil, as if the legend could be escorted from the building with a final cup of tea in the hallway. The oddest part of removal is that it rarely feels like removal. We call it modernization or chart correction or edition 7, and the circle disappears into professionalism without a ripple. But suppose the island was real in a friendly, unprovable way. Not a volcanic dome that sulked back under the waves after a tantrum, but a phenomenon composite enough to play the part of land convincingly. A sequence of swells, a procession of clouds, a solitary stack. The disciplined geometry of the mirage doing just the right arithmetic at lunch. Add in the human ingredient crew tired as rope, eyes rinsed with salt, and you have a territory sturdy enough to visit for an hour. It would be a very Irish solution, an island that exists for those who must see it and takes a day off for everyone else. Like a pub that refuses to open until conversation arrives. Back on shore, the land of eternal knowledge keeps lending metaphors to the discussion. Imagine a district where maps never need updating because the landscape respects routine. Gates never sag, and if they do, they sag on a schedule with posted hours. People there learn slowly, which is to say, permanently, and no one raises their voice because the weather has already done the talking. It is tempting to believe that Hy-Brasil existed to give shape to this longing, the way a teacup gives shape to steam. Places like that are easier to carry when they are drawn. A circle weighs almost nothing. A bisecting line gives it a hinge. Fold and tuck. Hope goes pocket-sized. The Celtic otherworld connection threads through this politely. The otherworld is not behind the sky. It shares a fence with fields you already know. The fence is built of customs and pauses. Someone plays a tune in a kitchen whose owner you cannot immediately remember. Someone offers bread that tastes suspiciously like yesterday and tomorrow. Hy-Brasil aligns with this geography of almosts. It's not an escape. It's an excuse, respectable, portable, weather-compatible. If the island did nothing more than let fishermen explain why they were late with a grin and a shrug, that alone would justify ink. Now we arrive at the scientific lecture whispered under a blanket. Mirages are not lies. They are the atmosphere doing trigonometry in a kindly voice. Warm air hovers above cold water and bends the paths of light so that distant margins climb on top of themselves. Think of a hallway lined with mirrors, but the mirrors are obedient currents in the sky. Ships appear doubled. A coast rises and then rearranges itself. A bank enlarges into a headland. A cloud shadow becomes a river with a very straight sense of humor. Meteorology calls the stack of images a superior mirage, which is both descriptive and a little snooty. Under certain conditions, the layers lock into a duct that carries images for many miles, like a slide traveling down a child's toy tunnel. The sea is full of such devices and sees no reason to explain them individually. Everything else fits into the drawer labeled human habits. A reported saying earns its place. A symbol becomes beloved. The circle looks nice next to the compass rose. The split line keeps the balance of the page. There is a reason why office meetings keep producing action items that resemble last month's action items, but with fresh dates. Continuity is soothing. We do not abolish a chair simply because a guest missed the train once or twice a century. It is helpful to remember this when judging the past. If Hy-Brasil had never been drawn at all, we might have invented it now just to give the west of Ireland a conversational partner. Why did the island vanish from maps? Because maps learned to speak in fewer adjectives. Because ships learned to keep time in brass. Because the economy of ink tightened its belt. Because someone realized that captains prefer certainty with their porridge. The grand truth is ungrand. When the world becomes measurable in a new way, the furniture shifts. Legends become curiosities. Curiosities become ornaments. Ornaments migrate to the end papers of folklore where they breathe more comfortably. Notice, though, how the island survives anyway. It is the easiest thing in the world to remember, a circle and a line. You could draw it on the back of a receipt, and you would have most of the story. If, all the same, the island were real, and if it rose one unhurried afternoon as your boat pushed from Galway's mouth to the larger water, what would you do? You would slow the canvas and check your soundings with the nonchalance of someone tying a shoe. You would watch the birds and distrust the birds, and then watch them again. You would ask the cook to keep the soup warm. You would discuss quietly whether a landing would offend any departmental regulations about visiting places that rumored themselves into being. You would promise not to collect specimens, except perhaps a thimble of its silence. And if, as you drew near, the island rearranged itself into ordinary horizon, you would write appearance of land, a sentence designed for hope that plans to sleep in. The charm of Hy-Brasil is not that it tricks us, but that it trains us in a soft skill, the ability to hold a maybe without dropping it or hugging it to death. This is useful at sea, and in kitchens, and on trains that pause in fields for reasons nobody announces. It is useful when looking at the future, which spends much of its time acting like a superior mirage. The island lets us practice the sentence, it could be, and then another important sentence, it might not be, and the follow-up. Either way, we should have lunch. Even the legends packed kindness into their schedules. 7 years is just enough time to repair nets, polish stories, and decide to grow older with a little style. I like to think the last cartographer who scratched Hy-Brasil onto a sheet of good paper did so with quiet respect, knowing perfectly well the hydrographers were coming with their protractors and their disciplined cross-hatching. He drew the circle one more time, bisected it like a good melon, labeled it with letters slightly taller than necessary, and then placed his tools in their case, each in its little groove. He was not wrong. He was thorough in a different direction. The sea doesn't mind. It has visited more papers than any of us and outlived all of them. It is content to carry islands that sit squarely on wood and islands that ride only on sentences. So we leave the map open on the table and the candle burns low, and the room performs that comfortable trick where objects grow friendlier as shadows lengthen. The circle remains unbothered. The line divides nothing in particular and does it very well. Outside, the night makes its case for continuing exactly as it is. You can almost hear a tide turning somewhere you don't need to be. If, in your own thoughts, there is an island you keep meaning to verify, let it rest where it rests. Draw it if you like. Fold the page along the neat little cord. Set it aside for 7 years or until morning, whichever arrives first. You might not expect a tiny circle with a neat little line through it to keep so many cartographers company for so long, but there it sits on old. Sea charts west of Ireland polite as a saucer labeled with a sort of name that sounds like a sigh. Hy-Brasil. It does not shout. It does not even commit to a shape beyond the circle that a careful hand can draw in one calm breath. Yet that small sign has the gravitational pull of a nap. If you're still awake when we drift into the part with temperature inversions and superior mirages, you're welcome to subscribe for more very quiet mysteries, or don't, I will absolutely never know. The early map makers certainly did not hurry. They copied what looked reasonable, they borrowed from the last chart that felt trustworthy, and they did it all by the warm patience of candlelight where ink dries like evening dew and an island can appear because the page would like one there. The old portolan charts are friendly in a fussy way. Compass roses bloom like tidy snowflakes, and rum lines cross the sea in disciplined diagonals that seem to hold the world gently in place. On certain sheets, you can see a circle west of Galway Bay, sometimes shaded, sometimes bisected, sometimes paired with a dot as if the island kept a spare in the drawer. The Catalan mapmakers had a soft spot for it. The Venetian ones did too. The circle behaves like a period that someone has stretched into a thought. When a map contains that much ocean, The temptation to add one considerate island is strong, and Hy-Brasil was considerate. It asked very little of anyone except a label. Sailors encouraged the tradition with the kind of sentences they prefer to write at 4 in the morning, restrained, a little cautious, and somehow very specific about being unsure. An appearance of land, one captain wrote, a phrase that manages to see something and not promise too much about it. Others spoke of a low shore lifting inside mist, of cattle bells heard where no pasture should be, of a warm smoke smell that seemed utterly domestic and in no way theatrical. A few returned with stories of landing and bartering and returning, and the stories have that comfortable rhythm ships tailies acquire when everyone knows exactly where the mugs are stored. It isn't that these witnesses lied. It is that the sea tests eyesight the way a librarian tests whispering. Even the most honest description comes out softer than it went in. The island also had a life inland, and speech that enjoyed taking its time. Hy-Brasil was said to be a place where knowledge behaved politely. You could visit without being dazzled or scolded. Wisdom walked there like a good neighbor, never late for anything, never in a rush. The butter did not burn. The hay understood the weather. People came back from the island with the look of someone who has slept well and forgotten why. Ireland kept a drawer full of such places, and they rarely clattered when you opened it. Hy-Brasil was less a miracle than a relief, a location where effort did not seethe so much. You can hear why fishermen approved. A good catch is fine, but a good rest is sensible. Then there was the other world, which in those stories is never so far that a person must shout. The borders are made of weather and attention. Mists do the housekeeping, lifting and folding in their own time. Sometimes every 7 years, the island showed itself in a shy, convenient way, as if it too were on a repeating schedule and had marked the day in its calendar. The number is comfortable. It sounds like the sort of interval that lets tools be sharpened and nets be mended, and a person grow a little more patient without having to make speeches about it. A traveler glimpsing the coast could say they had seen the elsewhere that lives beside the ordinary, and nobody would feel obliged to hurry or disagree. Explanations eventually packed their briefcases and arrived, as they tend to do, with rulers that fold neatly into segments. The Atlantic rearranges light over cold water, and warm air settles above it in a way that persuades distant coasts to stand up where they do not live. Superior mirage, the textbooks call it, which is both descriptive and a little smug. In such conditions, a small rock may be pulled long and flat into a convincing shore. A cloud line may become a palisade. Shadows acquire the quiet authority of rivers. The effect can even stack images like plates, a double coastline balanced upon conditions delicate as pastry. From a deck washed in brine and patience, an island drifts out of the optics with the same steady assurance as a harbor you have finally reached. Errors of tradition help. A circle drawn once as a rumor becomes, on the next chart, a courtesy, and by the third, a habit. A bisecting line might mean reported but unverified, or seen in fog, or simply this symbol pleases the eye. But in time, it becomes just part of how the island dresses for the page. Cartographers inherited each other's choices with the same resigned affection by which offices inherit potted plants. Nobody wanted to throw out the island and explain the empty space to a captain who had been comforted by it for years. Paper is patient and the sea is large, and a small certainty can be useful even when it is decorative. Behind the optics and the customs sits the underwater topography that tutors waves into certain moods. Banks rise from the continental shelf like thoughtful furniture. The Porcupine Bank lies out there under the water, teaching tides to wrinkle in ways that might look like shoreline from the height of a foredeck. Kelp can raft itself into dark acres that move together with suspicious citizenship. Birds find fronts of life in the sea and traffic in wide circles that from far off resemble a town meeting. Add a long swell lifting a line of cloud, and the sea begins to impersonate itself with the confidence of a veteran actor. An island is a simple interpretation when everything hints at land. By the 19th century, the new charts walked into the room with the posture of instruments that tick. Chronometers kept time in the crisp voice of brass. Triangulation climbed headlands with tripods and notebooks. Hydrographic offices issued corrections that felt like spring cleaning. A symbol once beloved began to look like an heirloom that nobody wanted to dust. The circle faded to a dotted suggestion, then to a note, and then to silence. The mood of the age preferred that islands explain themselves promptly. Hy-Brasil had never been very talkative. In the language of bureaucracy, it lacked actionable coordinates. If you like a whisper of intrigue with your tea, you might ask whether anyone, anywhere, decided that the story was inconvenient and filed it away. But conspiracies rarely choose the tempo of a yawn. What happened looks like ordinary tiding. When ships grew precise, maps did too. When maps grew precise, romantic symbols developed the wobble of a chair with one shorter leg. The island did not so much vanish as retire. It left the office keys on the hook, labeled them in a clear hand, and went to live where stories breathe easier. Still, it is an entertaining exercise to suppose the island was real in the quiet way. Certain things are real when several smaller truths share a table. Suppose you have a bank, a raft of weed, a herd of birds, a temperature duct, a generous swell, and eyes salted by a long watch. Together they take on the responsibility of being land for a dignified hour. A boat eases its canvas, the lead line goes down, a careful note is made about fathoms and bottom, and perhaps a sounding reports something that later refuses to be found. Appearance of land, the log records, which is not a lie. It is a recognition that reality sometimes travels as a convoy. The old legends nod along with that thought. The land of eternal knowledge never promised miracles. It promised a landscape where work answered to reason and bread tasted the same every morning. People visited and came back steadier. The place is almost aggressively plausible. No golden streets, no tiresome perfection, just a jurisdiction where weather and wisdom keep sensible hours, and where a stranger can walk through mist and out again without feeling lectured. Such a location requires very little geology. It requires manners. The sea can provide those when air and light and the patience of observers agree. The otherworld connection extends the courtesy. In many Irish tailies, the border between here and there is a matter of attention rather than distance. You step out to the yard and notice that the yard is behaving well today. Perhaps that is because the yard has a neighbor you rarely see. Hy-Brasil takes that neighborliness offshore. Every 7 years is a schedule one can write on the back of a door. The magic is as bureaucratic as it is beautiful. It gives people time to prepare, mend, make tea, and decide what kind of story they will tell when they return. Science, to its credit, has never minded being sleepy when the subject suits it. Texts explain the Fata Morgana with diagrams that look like blankets layered on a clothesline. Rays bend, ducks carry images across quiet distances. A straight horizon turns into a gallery of soft steps. Under a certain calm, the light behaves as though someone had drawn a rule across it and told it to be polite. Mariners met the phenomenon often enough to give it names and move on. The sea is full of special effects that do not require applause. Hy-Brasil could be one of those long-running shows the ocean performs for an audience of tired people who appreciate a production that starts on time and ends, without curtain calls. The copying error has its own gravity. Anyone who has worked in a modern document knows the mysterious power of a template. If a table appears in a file from last year, the table will appear this year too, freshly lined but essentially the same. The circle and its dividing chord became the template's gift to maps of the North Atlantic. It balanced the page. It completed the sentence. Remove it, and the chart looked as though it had forgotten a word. keep it, and the chart looked finished. Many cultural artifacts survive by being good design. The question of disappearance, when asked kindly, produces unexciting answers that feel exactly right. Pilots wanted clear lights on real headlands. Lighthouses need rocks to stand on. Telegraph cables prefer not to be laid across islands that decline to attend the meeting. Insurance companies enjoy coordinates that can be typed only once. The new surveying culture granted these desires with the brisk satisfaction of a fresh ledger. In such a climate, an island available mainly in stories will find itself reassigned to folklore, where departments are fewer and office hours suit the imagination. And if all the same, it was real in one of those ways that defy audit, why hide it or forget it? Perhaps because not every pleasant thing needs a fairy timetable. A place that reassures chiefly by existing might work best by being difficult to schedule. The calm left by such a possibility is itself a small service. The Atlantic is big. It is healthy for a map to admit that some of its bigness is measured in rumors that sleep well. What remains, as the candle runs down on the desk and the pages ruffle a little in the night air, is the feeling of a circle and a line performing their modest task. People before us drew them carefully. People after us look at the old drawing and feel a pocket of relief. There was room once for a maybe, and the world did not collapse. If you set a finger on that circle now, you can almost hear water without waves, and gulls without shouting, and a bell that no one insists on finding. The ink settles, the sea continues. The island, which may or may not be attending, nods from somewhere a few nautical miles into the idea of sleep. You might not expect an island to survive for centuries by being mostly a circle of ink, but Hy-Brasil did almost exactly that, hovering just west of Ireland like a polite thought someone forgot to erase. It turns up on calm old sea charts the way a moon turns up in a child's drawing, neat, round, and a little too perfect to be suspicious. Some mapmakers even added a straight line across the middle, as if the island had been folded for storage. That small mark is a soft doorbell. At the edge of Europe. Press it, and a quiet house of stories opens. If you happen to be awake in a few minutes when we reach the part about temperature inversions, you may subscribe for more gently confusing geography, though please don't set an alarm just for that. Hy-Brasil can wait. It has already waited. For hundreds of years with the patience of a single, uncomplaining circle, the early cartographers had time on their hands and salt on their sleeves. They copied coastlines by candlelight and made the sea behave with webs of rum lines, those tidy diagonals that look like a string art project someone left on the kitchen table. A map with so much open water can feel like a room without furniture. So the little circle of Hy-Brasil is not only an island, but also a decorative decision. In some 14th and 15th century charts, it sits almost due west of Galway, near enough to be plausible and far enough to be interesting, like a distant cousin who may or may not exist, but has already been assigned a chair at dinner. In a few places, the circle even gets shaded a faint gray blush, as if the paper were thinking about weather. Sailors cooperated in the usual sailorly way, by writing things that sound like facts even when the ocean is helping them be unsure. Land seen in the mist, one captain wrote, which is a sentence shaped like a shrug. Shore heard, said another, which is charming if you consider how shore might sound at a distance. A hush of surf. A crowd of birds discussing leadership. The wooden conversation of a boat rubbing a pier that isn't there. One voyage claimed cattle bells. Another claimed smoke. A few claim landings and good barter, and these stories have the gentle rhythm of sea talk at 4 a.m. What a pot is on, and nobody would make up something expensive. If you ask why charts kept the island after so many uncertain sightings, the answer is pleasingly bureaucratic. Once a symbol is on the template, removing it requires forms. The island drifted simultaneously in the quieter river of legend, and there the details are surprisingly domestic. Hy-Brasil was not. Noisy with gold or fraught with tests. It was a place where knowledge did paperwork without drama. You could go there and feel tidier on the way home. The butter didn't burn. Nets mended themselves only a little faster than usual. People came back saying they knew the name of a bird they had not noticed before. The land of eternal knowledge. Some called it, which is flattering but also comfortable, like finding a drawer already labeled with the thing you wanted to put inside. It makes sense that fishermen would appreciate an island whose most famous attribute was understanding. If you push a little farther downstream into the Celtic otherworld, Hy-Brasil becomes an address written on fog. It is not entirely here, or there. It is exactly as solid as attention. The island is said to appear every 7 years, a schedule so practical it could be printed on a wall calendar. Every 7 years feels reasonable. There's time to finish building something, to consider a haircut, to forget exactly where the good knife lives. The border with the other world in these stories is not a fence. It is better housekeeping. You take a step and the weather agrees. To behave. People who came home with sightings treated the mirage of Hy-Brasil as if it were a well-mannered neighbor. One crew reported the shoreline lifting from the morning haze like a theater curtain that had misplaced its orchestra. Another saw trees with the confidence of trees that had never been told about storms. Very often the island moved when you sailed, which is another way of saying the sea reminded observers that human perspective is an instrument with a sense of humor. A ship running down a phantom coast learns humility at a useful speed. Then, slowly and with admirable patience, the science walked in. Light passing over cold water bends toward the dense air, like a student who has discovered gravity just now, and wishes to cooperate. A warm layer above a cold sea becomes a duct, and the duct carries images across longer distances than our instincts allow. Faraway coasts climb into visibility and gain extra floors like buildings in a polite dream. This is the superior mirage. When it stacks and stretches and multiplies into crenellated cliffs and floating shelves, the old Italians gave it a lovely stage name, Fata Morgana. Not a fantasy, exactly, but the visual equivalent of hearing music through a wall and confidently. Naming the instrument, add practical maritime details, and a mirage becomes socially well supported. The Porcupine Bank lies out beyond Ireland, a proper underwater table that persuades waves to change behavior. On a day when wind holds its breath, long swell lines and temperature layers can teach the horizon to tell small, convincing lies. Kelp rafts gather, as cooperative as parish committees, and darken the water to the precise degree that distant eyes promote them to shoreline. A tight flock of birds follows a line of food and murmurs into the shape of a headland. It is all fine, normal behavior. Take an officer with a good spyglass, subtract 2 hours of sleep, add a circle he already expects to find, and Hy-Brasil begins to do what islands do when invited. Copying helped as well, as copying tends to do. Cartographers inherited information with the same fond resignation by which offices inherit ficus trees. A circle labeled Brazil in one atlas becomes Hy-Brasil in another, and then Insula de Brazil, and occasionally Isala. De Brazil, because the sea speaks many dialects. The dividing line across the circle likely meant reported but unverified in somebody's system, then became fashionable, then became how the island was drawn, because that is how the island is drawn. The mark drifted from warning to wardrobe. If a chart looked bare without it, the island stayed. One can imagine a careful apprentice being told to leave the symbol, not for science, but because the page feels more finished with it, dot legends kept pace, untroubled by the improving optics. The land of eternal knowledge turned into the setting for gentle errands. Someone went to Hy-Brasil and learned a cure for a small cough that had done excellent stubborn work all winter. Someone else returned with a new method for stacking peat, so it dries with better manners. The island in these tales rarely instructs with thunder. It whispers, and the whisper is something you could have discovered yourself on a good day. The image of an island devoted to modest competence is curiously restful. It makes you want to check that your broom has a proper hook. The otherworld connection felt equally responsible. In Irish tradition, the borderlands are not far away. They are adjacent, like a room you always notice only when the door swings in a draft. A hero meets a woman who is not quite human and returns. With a skill that turns out to be patience, a musician plays in a hall beneath a hill and comes back convinced he has learned the difference between silence and quiet. Hy-Brasil sits offshore doing a similar favor for the open sea. Every 7 years it is almost there. That is sufficient. The possibility itself counts as hospitality. Eventually the skeptics collected their notes. Hydrographers triangulated with tall tripods that look like huts for very thin shepherds. Survey vessels ran lines and dropped leads, bringing up mud that sometimes had the manners to tell its depth. Instruments liked numbers and did not enjoy circles with lines through them. Admiralties began publishing lists of doubtful islands. Insurance companies developed opinions. Prisoners of habit, the maps made small sighing noises and complied. Hy-Brasil turned to dots, then to footnotes, then to silence. The 19th century liked islands that could host lighthouses. Hy-Brasil, which preferred to host conversations, found itself furloughed. Why did it vanish from maps? The reasons are almost boring, which is how you know they are persuasive. Reliable charts make commerce yawn happily. Steamships more or less ignore the romance of fog and prefer schedules with numbers that add. Telegraph cables do not appreciate surprise headlands. With the new precision, an island available chiefly to eyesight at certain temperatures looked less like a landmark and more like a mood. Cartography has room for many moods, but the office that prints sailing directions likes the ones that pay. Rent. A few people enjoy quieter explanations, and they are welcome to them. Was there a deliberate forgetting? A conspiracy to protect a secret shore? It is a cozy thought, like a teapot with an extra lid in case the first goes missing. But most conspiracies run at the loud speed of the impatient. Hy-Brasil took its time. Things that take their time usually end not with a scandal, but with a filing system. The island slipped from one drawer to another, and nobody lost sleep. Still, the question has a drowsy charm. What if it was real in the tidy sense the legends prefer? Real is a stack of small causes that together pretend to be one large effect. Consider a procession, a long swell, a superior mirage, a dark ribbon of birds rehearsing the outline of a coast, a sheet of kelp arranging itself like pasture, and perhaps below it all, a shallow place that lifts the ocean into better posture. A watch officer notes a changing color, marks a cautionary bearing, and enters appearance of land. That phrase is perfectly honest. Appearances are part of reality. The logbook understands. There is also the idea, not provable and therefore comfortable, that an actual low bank once met the air on certain tides and then did not. Submerged landscapes in that part of the Atlantic are not rare. They form, they fall, they learn to be furniture for fish. A storm can move a bar with the competence of a careful carpenter. A sand wave can decide to lie down, if Hy-Brasil touched. Daylight for one season or one lifetime of one family, and then went under. Maps would not easily forgive the trick. They would, however, remember the rumor. Meanwhile, the myths we keep sharpen in the drawer like knives that do not mind being neglected. The land of eternal knowledge becomes, to modern ears, simply the place where nothing is urgent. The wisdom is not secret, it is slow. It is knowing which knot you tie without looking. It is writing the boat's name on the oar so the oar and the boat agree in public. It is finishing the loaf just when the soup says thank you. Hy-Brasil, in that sense, is not west of Ireland but west of Hurry. Science remains pleased to explain the optics without ending the spell. A superior mirage can lift an island, flatten it, duplicate it above itself, or stretch it into a polite wall. It can slide a ship upside down over the real ship like a ghost, practicing social distance. Under the right conditions, a distant city can float. Observers record all this in sentences that keep their hats on indoors. The textbooks draw rays bending over layers of air like threads weaving through fabric. You look and your eyes agree. To cooperate. The sea has been entertaining itself this way since before we had words for thanks. The history of copying deserves its own pillow. The circle with the dividing cord is a tiny masterpiece of survival design. Every apprentice, seeing it, learned not only that a place might be there, but also how to mark uncertainty with grace. We still inherit such symbols. Asterisks tacked to claims, little triangles next to road names on digital maps, the faint gray of a path that has not been verified. These are Hy-Brasil's cousins. They say gently that reality has some maybes, and that maybes enjoy being included. When skeptics ask if Hy-Brasil was simply a mistake, one may agree and still keep the tone of a lullaby. Mistakes that persist are often doing extra work. They hold space for questions people want to keep asking. What is out there when we cannot see? How far does attention travel when the air cooperates? When is a story a landmark? An island that answers by appearing and receding teaches a lesson most textbooks do not grade, that seeing is a kind of conversation, and that the sea is fluent. By the time the Admiralty lists had swept the circle off the page, the island had already won a different residence permit. Folklore is not a demotion, it is simply a more comfortable chair. People continued to tell each other about the place, where the weather changes its mind and the horizon grows an extra shelf. They poured tea and remembered a cousin who swore he had seen it, and then remembered a man who said he had sold butter there. Reasonably priced, and everyone nodded because the price of butter is a detail no honest liar would risk. A rumor survives best when it understands groceries. Why it vanished from maps, then, is not an accusation. It is a symptom of precision. Compasses aged into gyros. Sextants got company from radio beacons. The ocean floor filled with contour, lines and numbers that stack like careful bricks. Among those confident integers, a circle with a modest name begins to look like a doodle. Ink gives way to coordinates, and coordinates rarely share a desk. Still, many pilots and sailors kept Hy-Brasil in the same pocket as St. Elmo's fire and green flashes at sunset, a category labeled things that make a watch nicer. And if finally you insist on the version where Hy-Brasil was real in a way no catalog can carry, there is an acceptable answer. It is real because 100 small, honest observations can form a single honest place in the mind. The island is as real as the smile you give a coastline when a lighthouse you expected decides to be exactly where it should be. It is as real as a logbook entry that says, soundings inconsistent, which is the measured way of saying the ocean briefly forgot to match the plan. Those moments leave a residue. Enough residue and a circle appears. The strangest part, and perhaps the most soothing, is that Hy-Brasil's disappearance required no drama, no last expedition, no final righteous correction. Just a gradual quieting, like a shop that stops ordering a certain kind of button because jackets have different tastes now. The old charts remain, their circles bright as moons in the glass cases of libraries, while the new ones slide into electronic screens that demand latitudes with 2 decimals. Somewhere between those 2 choices lives the island, tidy as ever, neither sulking nor campaigning, happy to be the place where you might, if the air slips into the correct posture, see land that politely refuses to be mandatory. So, if you stand on a wet pier after rain and face west into a horizon that is trying to remember itself, you may feel the light building ladders you cannot climb. A dark shine on the water will form the first line of a coastline. A smear of cloud will choose to be a hill. Birds will agree to outline a bay. You will smell something like turf smoke or kelp or the idea of porridge. You will look down at your hands and decide that today you will mend the net slowly and correctly. In a few hours, the mirage will step back into the air, and you will have nothing to show except a better knot and a sentence in a notebook. Appearance of land, it is enough. The world likes these small, tidy affirmations. If you are still awake, you may wonder whether a place designed for steady knowledge might be best left to exist as expectation. A lamb that emerges every 7 years does not want a hotel. It wants a listener. Hy-Brasil may simply be the moment the sea rewards you for watching it without hurrying. That, too, is a kind of island, and it disappears exactly when you start reaching for it, which is a very sensible policy for a place that has been doing its work perfectly well as a circle of ink. In another minute, the tide will go on, speaking in its low voice. The maps will keep their manners, and the island, which is nothing more or less than attention clarified, will float just far enough off the page to make the rest of the world feel pleasingly in order. You might not expect a neat little circle on a medieval sea chart, sometimes with a straight line, drawn through it like a biscuit scored for sharing to cause so much quiet trouble. And yet Hy-Brasil, that careful dot west of Ireland, managed exactly that for centuries, sitting on parchment with the stillness of a cat that has discovered the warmest square of sunlight. Cartographers kept giving it addresses, coordinates, even a personality, as if one could be polite to a horizon. If you're somehow still with me by the time we get to temperature inversions and the optical duck, two phrases that pair nicely with chamomile, feel free to subscribe for more drowsy geography, but please don't go looking for a bowel. Hy-Brasil prefers not to be rung. When you meet the early charts, you notice immediately how dignified they are. All those rum lines drifting across the page like strings on a very patient instrument. The portolan makers, the dulcerts, the benancases, the men who let the ink dry while the boat creaked under the mapped coasts first, because coasts have the good manners to stay where they are. Water is a rude subject, so the makers tamed it with compass roses, little suns with many teeth, and then rewarded themselves by adding bits of news. Hy-Brasil was precisely the kind of news a page enjoys. Round, memorable, the size of a coin. Not the nonsense of dragons, nor the solemnity of a capital, just a small suggestion that the sea might have left a breadcrumb. In a few atlases it comes with a dividing bar, which some scholars read as a symbol for uncertainty, although I like to think someone folded the island in half to check the symmetry and forgot to unfold it. Again, sailors obliged the ink by seeing what it asked to be seen. There are logs with sentences that sound like they were written while stirring porridge. Land, not constant, one says. Shore heard, says another, a phrase so charming you want to give it a chair. A few men swore they made landfall and traded for butter, which is exactly the kind of detail honest liars avoid, making it, paradoxically, feel trustworthy. There were reports of cattle bells and low fires, and of the island sliding away when pursued, like a shop closing quietly because the owner has remembered a better appointment. The sea will do that. It lets you chase your own perspective until your legs turn to string. The legend makers folded the circle into stories, as you might fold a napkin practically. Without theater, Hy-Brasil became a place where knowledge did not shout. People went there in tailies and returned with small improvements, the comfortable kind. A better way to mend a net, the right moment to lift a loaf from the oven, the name of a seabird whose presence had always been tolerated but never properly acknowledged. The land of eternal knowledge, it was called in Irish tellings, which sounds bold until you hear the examples and realize it means eternal as in reliable. Knowledge that is the intellectual equivalent of finding the scissors exactly where they belong. This is an island you could visit before lunch and still have time to straighten the pile of peat bricks. The other world noticed it too, of course. In that part of the world, the border between here and not quite here is less a wall than a polite understanding. Hy-Brasil was said to appear every 7 years, which is marvelous scheduling, long enough to forget where you put your good shoes, short enough to remember the way back once you find them. The island belonged to that Celtic habit of treating reality like lace solid enough to hold, but full of intentional gaps. Some stories say the island shares staff with the fairy courts, which explains the administrative precision. Others speak of a veil of mist that draws aside on days when attention minds its posture. If you have ever watched a loading bar inch forward in a tunnel and felt oddly proud of it, you understand the mood. All of which is charming, but the light itself likes to demonstrate how it handles rumors. A layer of warm air sitting on a skin, of cooler air bends light downward. The image of a far coast curves along the layer and keeps going like a note in a hallway. Distant shorelines rise over the horizon, flatten, stretch, and sometimes copy themselves into aerial twins. The Italians, generous with compliments, named this show Fata Morgana after Morgan Le Fay. The Irish, being practical even when romantic, simply watched and wrote things like island hereabouts when the air is in order. On the West Irish shelf, where the Porcupine Bank hoists the seabed nearer the surface, you can get all the ingredients at once: long swell, calm air, kelp rafts darkening the surface, and birds obligingly sketching a headland with their own bodies. Sprinkle on a captain who expects a circle because the chart invited him to, and Hy-Brasil boils gently into view. It did not hurt that map makers copy each other the way recipes pass through a family. Gaining a pinch of this in a line, through that, a round symbol with a chord meaning reported, not proved in one workshop became fashionable in another, and fashion is the most determined of cartographic winds. The circle wandered slightly on different charts, but always remained within, sailing distance of Galway, as if tethered by the idea of soup. Some printed atlases even split the island into two neat halves, north and south, an administrative gesture that suggests someone once tried to collect taxes there. Of course, see. Charts and stories are not the only furniture in the room. Hydrographers arrived with their theodolites and lead lines, their patient arithmetic, their willingness to measure a square of ocean until it confessed to being an unremarkable rectangle. As the 19th century laid down cables and schedules, islands with a talent for vanishing began to look unhelpful. Admiralty lists developed a category whose very title is a lullaby: doubtful islands. Doubtful things do not ruin anyone's evening, but they also do not get lighthouses. Hy-Brasil's symbol decayed to a dot, then to parentheses, then to the quieter dignity of omission. The sea remained precisely as busy as before. Legends continued to file their paperwork. People kept behaving as if Hy-Brasil were the sort of place where a person forgets to boast. A fisherman met a man there, in one version, who gave him a book he could never open. The fisherman took it home, and the family used it as a weight when salting meat. The moral seems to be that wisdom is often deployed in the kitchen. Another account says a gentleman got lost in fog, found himself welcomed, and was taught to read the weather by the way smoke behaves when it is slightly offended. He came back and turned this into a profession. The other world, you see, is not anti-practical. It merely keeps better minutes. When science explains the optics, It does so with the gentle voice of someone telling you how a trick is done and then immediately handing back your sense of wonder just to see if you notice. Superior mirages, ducks, and inversions sound like dull meetings, but together they turn a horizon into a well-run stage. Distant islands arrive in layers, cities float, ships lift themselves upside down and sail above their own images as if practicing posture. Your eye believes because it wants to. Light is persuasive when it acts slowly. Even now, with satellites drawing the sea like a crisp bedsheet, a warm layer over a cold ocean can still persuade your attention to write down land scene, then add the nervous but honest qualifier, appearance, lost land, or simple error. The phrase implies a choice, but errors that last for 500 years are rarely simple. They are usually doing extra work. Copying kept the symbol alive because it felt wrong to delete it. Sailors kept filing sightings because the sea kept supplying something to see. Expectation itself is a craftsman. When you stand watch where 10 watches before you have written Hy-Brasil, your mind will help the air assemble a shore from the respectable materials at hand. A line of kelp, a wedge of cloud, the corporate decision of goals to be a peninsula for 5 patient minutes. The result is not false. It is participatory. Eventually, precision became fashionable to the point of mischief. Telegraph stations wanted their messages to arrive at exactly the same island every time. Steamship companies preferred schedules to legends. Insurance clerks do not enjoy paying for ships that collide with metaphors. The Admiralty therefore sent men with notebooks and gritted teeth. When nothing tougher than swell turned up where the old circle waited, they did not hold a funeral. They simply issued a new edition. The silence that follows an omitted symbol is the quietest sound in publishing. Why did it vanish from maps after the 19th century? Because standardization is a tide of its own. Printing plates are expensive. Engraving an island that keeps injuring confidence is like reserving a seat for a guest who writes occasionally to say they cannot attend. Lighthouses cannot be built on a temperature inversion. The Royal Navy found it difficult to authorize a buoy anchored to a rumour, and when the first reliable bathymetric surveys traced the West Irish Shelf with contour lines as smug as marching bands, none of those lines felt particularly circular. So Hy-Brasil retired from official service and took a pleasant post in folklore, where the benefits include immortality and relaxed dress codes. What if, all the same, it was real in the unromantic sense? There are kind answers that do not disturb. Sleep, shallow banks move. Storms pick up sand and put it elsewhere the way a tidy person moves a vase 2 inches to the left. A low reef can breach now and then, the way a shy whale shows a scar. A few seasons of appearances would be more than enough to wedge an island into maps for centuries, especially if those seasons lined up with the 7-year rhythm storytellers already liked. Another gentle theory admits the existence of acoustic shores. On very still days, the hiss of breakers from a distant coast can travel farther than sight, making a listener sincerely hear land. Add the smell of kelp, which is happy to arrive without an invitation, and your senses stage a small, competent conspiracy. Conspiracies of the juicier sort enjoy a moment here too, because bedtime allows a controlled quantity of mischief, perhaps. Say the inventive, the island was a monastery with excellent boundaries, a place that welcomed visitors politely and then edited its dress from every memory, or a smuggler's haven improved by a routine of deliberate mischarting. There is little evidence for any of that, but little evidence is precisely the amount required for a rumor to have good posture. The more boring truth that ink is sticky and copying is contagious doesn't object. It simply nods and lets the lights dim. Meanwhile, the circle has left handsome fossils behind. The Catalan atlas shows it coyly. Later charts hit it more. firmly, like a guest of honor who returns everyone's spoons at the end of the meal. In Irish language scholarship, you find it called Hy-Brasil or Ó-Brasil, names that sound like cousins who lend tools without asking questions. Antiquarians note that the island's corded symbol resembles others used for reported but unverified, which makes Hy-Brasil a mascot for the asterisk, the punctuation mark that says, "Softly, the world is complicated but still worth." Describing, digital maps still carry such spirit gray dashed paths, cautionary labels, the small maybe that software uses when it cannot decide between road and river. Hy-Brasil, long gone from official charts, continues as an operating system for doubt. You can imagine a night watchman aboard a packet boat in 1847, eyes watering from the usual breeze, remembering his grandfather's instruction to look west. For the clever island, the air cools by a few precise degrees. A slick on the water darkens where kelp forms a corridor. There is a line that might be land, and above it a second line too high for comfort. He writes appearance of land because he is honest, then adds likely mirage because he has been briefed, then keeps looking anyway because attention is a kind of prayer. He is not wrong. The island, which prefers gratitude to proof, accepts the entry. If you later visit the same horizon from shore, you may catch the trick yourself. It will be quiet when it happens. A far city's reflection rises, stretches, settles. A floating shelf becomes a beach. Your body almost believes it could walk along if it were suddenly 20 miles taller. The wind checks its coat at the door, and the air arranges itself into layers like good pastry. For a few minutes, the world behaves like an orderly rumor. The old circle reappears without ink and waits without comment, while you decide whether to be impressed or simply calmed. Both are acceptable. There is a small romance in the way Hy-Brasil teaches manners to certainty. The island asks you to accept that perception is a collaboration, not a verdict. It suggests that maps are sentences we keep editing and that a cross line through a circle is not an error so much as an admission of process. Modern science, which can summon a satellite to check on the kelp in an afternoon, does not dismantle that lesson. It gives it better lighting. The mirage is not less lovely because it is lawful. The law itself has a poet's patience is for. The island's reputation as a place of endless knowledge that might simply be what happens when you fish with your eyes open. Eternal knowledge can be a very short list, where the wind is hiding, how to stack turf so it dries instead of sulks, when to be content with the chart you have, and when to pencil in a question mark. People who brought such wisdom home felt they had visited a country rather than merely behaved attentively. It is a distinction one can happily allow at bedtime dot, so Hy-Brasil departed the official record without ceremony, becoming that most survivable of things, a good story. Not a dramatic story, just a very tidy one, the kind that fits in a pocket and resists the wash. Librarians preserve the old charts in drawers that open with the modesty of hymnals. Students leaf past the circle in its calm chord and feel the pleasant irritation of a mystery that has already decided you may keep it. The island enjoys being consulted but not concluded dot. If tonight you are near water, any water will do. You might try a small experiment in honor of the circle. Stand where the sky is practicing its grayscale and watch the horizon with the seriousness of someone waiting for the kettle. Blink less than you think you should. Notice how the light edits itself. A cloud decides to be a hill for a generous moment. A group of gannets performs the outline of a bay. Somewhere in your chest, an old map smiles because you are finally using it properly, not as a verdict, but as an invitation. When the shapes drift back into being plainly what they are, you can write your own entry. Appearance of land, satisfactory. Then go inside, label something that never had a label, and sleep in the competent knowledge that not every circle requires an answer. You might not expect a neat little circle with a small horizontal slash through it. No mountains, no rivers, just a tidy geometry to tug whole voyages a little to the left. But there, west of Ireland on certain old sea charts, sat Hy-Brasil, calmly occupying ink as if it owned the page. The first time you see it on a 14th century portolan, it looks like a biscuit someone has scored before baking. Cartographers gave it latitude the way one gives a cat a chair, not strictly necessary, but it seemed polite. If you're awake enough to appreciate a quiet island that sometimes exists and sometimes prefers not to, you may follow along. And if you remain conscious a few minutes from now, feel free to subscribe for more sleepy maritime irregularities. But please, don't exert yourself. Hy-Brasil has waited centuries. It can wait out one more yawn dot. Those early map makers had practical habits. They drew coasts first because coasts tend to honor appointments. Then they layered on winds and courses, all those rum lines radiating like threads you would not dare pull. Compass roses bloomed at intervals, each with just enough theater to convince a sailor the world had firm opinions. In the corners, someone would add an island that belonged to rumor but had good references. Hy-Brasil's charm was its moderation. It was not a dragon with commentary. It was a quiet circle. Some manuscripts added the little bar, a cartographic. Shrug meaning seen by somebody somewhere, which feels accurate in a way data tables sometimes envy. Copying helped. Map shops in Majorca, Venice, and Genoa borrowed liberally from one another the way families share stew recipes. If a colleague had an island that made the margin look complete, you copied the island. If the neighbor gave theirs a line through it, you kept the line. No one wanted to be the first to undraw a place and then find it later looking injured. So the circle endured. It drifted a few degrees from chart to chart, as one does when left to one's own devices, but it stayed near Galway and the Porcupine Bank, that submerged plateau whose name sounds like a tavern and behaves like a shelf. Sailors did their part by reporting exactly what the sea excels at, brief apparitions that respect a schedule known only to the atmosphere. Logs mention land that rose from haze, flattened like bread under a patient palm, and then thinned away as if the horizon had changed its mind. One captain swore he smelled turf smoke, which is the olfactory equivalent of a handshake. Another wrote that he heard blowing. The Atlantic is generous with sounds it fabricates from wind, wave, and a person's readiness to listen. There were also more pedestrian notes. Water discolored to the west and seafowl many, which are perfectly reasonable observations and also the ingredients of an island if your thoughts are already preheated by a chart dot. The stories never rushed. In Irish tradition, the island belonged to the tidy end of the marvelous, a place where one learns useful things and comes home before supper. Hy-Brasil is sometimes called the land of perpetual knowledge, which in practice seems to mean knowledge that will still be relevant on Thursday. People returned with refined instructions for salting salmon, with a better method for turning a cow in a doorway, with competent superstitions that kept boats humble and roofs honest. It was not an island of prophecy so much as an island of properly labeled drawers. Tellers linked it, as they do with the other world. Not the thunderous one, but the adjacent realm where boundaries are written in pencil. In some versions, the island showed itself only on a cycle 7 years as popular, perhaps because it is comfortably longer than a winter and short enough to plan for. Misted and revealed it the way curtains behave when they remember they are fabric. Travelers saw lights. A few met hospitable people who insisted on no names, which is the fairy approach to customer service. They came back with stories in which no one shouted, which is one way you know the island was run by professionals. Still, light has a career of its own, and it loves explaining things while changing nothing. Fata Morgana, for instance, is a superior mirage that lifts distant coasts into view, stretches them like dough, then stacks them into terraces that seem designed for gentle walking. Warm air sitting atop colder air makes a dock really just a polite corridor through which light glides. Farther than usual, bending with the planet and returning with gossip. On the West Irish Shelf, where the seafloor rises like a submerged table, you get exactly the conditions mirages relish. Long swell, calm air, and a contrast sharp enough to frame a forgery. Kelp darkens the surface into textual hints of shoreline. Birds sign their names along it, and the horizon briefly cosplays as an island dot that you had expectation. Expectation is a loyal engineer. A lookout who has spent nights at sea staring west with a chart in his pocket that promises a round island is prone to blend cloud, bird, slick, and intent into something land-like. He will write a sentence that makes perfect sense to a future. Self, appearance of land full W by S. He will add a question mark, and then a parenthesis, which is the nautical spelling of hope. He is not inventing. He is participating in reality's rehearsal. Meanwhile, workshops continued copying. The circled away monasteries copy, marginal saints that have fallen slightly out of favor but still look nice near the initial letter. A few engravers committed to symmetry split Hy-Brasil into northern and southern halves with a narrow channel between, like a sandwich that has decided to wait for the knife. The two-island version appears sometimes with names. Sometimes the halves are blank, the cartographic equivalent of you-know-who. Imprinted at laces, the island often gets the same line weight as a rock that can tread a hull, which was helpful for concentrating the minds of anyone at the tiller and mildly unhelpful for accuracy. The aura of wisdom refused to evaporate. People kept saying the island offered instruction, and the examples are as soothing as they are odd. A herdsman learns a way to repair a cracked churn using warmed honey and patience. A sailor is shown how to judge an unseen squall by the color of a stray gannet's feet, an item of knowledge that cannot possibly be true and yet improves morale. A woman returns knowing 3 names for the exact moment before dawn when nets most want to be lifted. The idea is clear. Hy-Brasil did not. Trade in revelations so much as in maintenance tips for existence. Skeptics eventually took seats on deck. Hydrographers set out with sounding lines, a bucket full of arithmetic, and the serene belief that numbers enjoy being asked. They measured where the island should have been and found water of ordinary depth. Behaving with its usual liquefaction, Admiralty lists began to use that tactful category, doubtful, which is quietly devastating when applied to geography. Hy-Brasil became a parenthetical presence, then an asterisk, and then the blank space that maps were like good hats. This does not remove the mirage. On certain afternoons, the horizon still dallies. The air decides very temporarily to be a lens. In the language of optics, a temperature inversion creates a refractive gradient. In the language of the patient, the day makes up its mind to show you farther than you deserve, and then takes it back without apology. Distant islands appear twice, upside down and right side up. A ship sails above its ghost. Thin cloud morphs. Into a low beach you can feel in your ankles. Island, your mind admits, just long enough to assemble a small, shy happiness. And then the lines soften and you feel slightly mistaken, but not harmed. The question of lost land versus simple. Error is fond of disguises. It poses as a debate, but behaves like a handshake. Yes, sandbank shift. Yes, submerged ridges can raise uneasy water that looks like shoreline. The porcupine bank sits there, raising eyebrows. Storm surges can change a profile. Heavy kelp can. Mass like a congregation. The sea gathers coincidences the way a desk gathers paper clips. At the same time, scribal habits are extraordinary. One circle copied faithfully, class after class of apprentice, can outlive the reason for the first circle by centuries. To call that simple is to underestimate the stamina of tradition. By the 19th century, accuracy became fashionable in the way cuffs become fashionable, suddenly and with tailoring. The telegraph punished delays. Steamships kept schedules the wind couldn't bully. Insurance companies became allergic to islands with conditional attendance. Surveyors, serious. As accountants went out and returned with contours and soundings that left little room for round notations unmoored to assault. Hy-Brasil began to leave the official company of capes and banks and joined the quieter firm of folklore, which never insists and always remembers birthdays. Why did it vanish from maps? Because the maps changed their minds about what they are. 4. Medieval charts were partly instruction and partly conversation. The grand printed charts of the modern age are memoranda to machinery. One has room for a rumor nicely drawn. The other wants verified coordinates, ideally with a lighthouse and a resident who will reply to mail. Hy-Brasil supplied neither lighthouse nor postmaster. It excelled at impressions. The editor stopped calling Dot, and yet the island lingers, so, well, you can almost see it while being told it is not there. Let's say it had been real in the prosaic sense just once, or for a few seasons. What then? A small sand cay that rose in an exceptional calm could have hosted birds and the human certainty that food is nearby. A reef that occasionally dried. At spring low water might have looked genuine to anyone unafraid of damp ankles. A seamount with a stubborn upwelling could have made its own weather, wrapping the blank sea in a localized haze that behaves like architecture. A person who anchored on a slip listened to breakers that were really distant echoes traveling well in steady air, and smelled kelp performing its honest chemistry would be forgiven for writing home about a shore. Some like a livelier theory. They picture a hidden monastic settlement, deliberate about secrecy, professional about fob, or a smuggler station with an arrangement, appear to the right people and otherwise keep a low profile. The evidence is thin, as evidence for charming ideas usually is, and your pillow prefers lighter weights. Still, one appreciates a legend willing to clock in for night shifts. While all this thinking goes on, the paper versions continue their quiet lives in drawers deeper than you expect. A curator slides one open and there the circle is, still balanced like a coin on a fingertip. The vellum has stretched minutely, the ink has browned into a tone your eye enjoys trusting, and the island keeps its modest poise. The label varies. Hy-Brasil, O-Brasil, Hy-Brasil. The spellings sound like cousins attending the same reunion and refusing to argue about that vowel. On some sheets, the chord through the circle looks like an afterthought. On others, it is as deliberate as a tie. In each case, the symbol means the same thing. We heard. We cannot guarantee. Here it is anyway. Every now and then the modern world puts on the old spectacles. Photographers catch mirage cities at the horizon towers floating and turned upside down over lakes. Distant oil platforms duplicating themselves like conscientious clerks. Weather logs still use the word looming, which is pleasingly medieval for a forecast. And there are days on the Irish coast when a person with no plan discovers an appetite for simply facing west. The eye rests. The sea practices long sentences without verbs. A dark line starts behaving like shoreline. A gull draws punctuation across it. The mind, polite as always, nods. Yes, that's enough to be going on with the island's association. With eternal knowledge grows less puzzling when one notices how humble the knowledge is. Eternal in this context seems to mean keeps working even if you move house. How to cut a peat block cleanly. Which day to mend nets so the knots agree. Where to put a loaf so it cools like a citizen. Even now, when the word knowledge often. Where's a cape it did not earn? Hy-Brasil's curriculum feels comfortable. Observational, domestic, calmly transferable. It is the University of Situational Awareness. The degree is warm hands. The disappearance from printed maps had another small cause: typesetting. Engravers had to carve every dot and label into copper. Removing a dubious island saved minutes. Saving minutes collected into hours and hours into additions. A missing circle could be indifference, or it could be wage policy. Either way, the Atlantic went on being its ancient self, which is to say, very good at holding water and opinions. If you wish to visit the island under the most generous conditions, you will not need a boat. You will need a day that behaves itself. Patient air with a lid of slightly warmer air above it, and a stretch of view where edges agree to be edges. Stand quietly quiet is important. Hy-Brasil enjoys indoor voices and wait until your eye settles into its task like a cat into a box that fits. Something far out will elongate, then flatten, as if it had remembered it is late for an appointment. Your chest will perform a small approval. You will think, without wanting to make a fuss, there it is. And then the light will decide to be literal again, and you will have lost nothing but a very small amount of factual pride. Maps forgive us for such moments by allowing marginalia. Even digital ones have the spirit, the gray of approximate, the dash path, the labels seasonal. If Hy-Brasil were a modern interface element, it would be the helpful tooltip that appears when you hover, then vanishes when you commit. The island trained us for that. It taught us how to be comfortable with a checkbox that sometimes unticks itself. The conspiracy of disappearance therefore ends, if one can call it an ending, with a shrug that has practiced. Charts grew up, or at least became grumpy. Mirages continued folding their laundry. Legends stopped knocking loudly and started sending postcards instead. The island takes no offense. It exists handsomely in the company of asterisks, along with phantom capes, ill-advised sandbanks, and towns that moved uphill and forgot to notify the gazetteer. When the wind is inattentive, it still surfaces, slow as good bread, to show that the line between belief and measurement is not a wall but a promenade. If, later tonight, your room has its own kind of horizon, the edge of a shelf, the border of a curtain, you can practice Hy-Brasil's lesson without leaving the bed. Watch the line lovingly until it acquires a second line you did not request. Allow the light from a passing car to do the work of the sun. Let the mind join in, not to trick you, but to collaborate. When the extra line goes away, do not be stern. With yourself, write an invisible log entry if it helps. Island, probable. Duration, adequate. The circle with the slash will be pleased. And like most legends that keep tidy hours, it will understand if you drift off before you finish. The sentence. You wouldn't expect a small circle with a neat horizontal line through it to alter the way Captain slept, but Hy-Brasil managed that with nothing more than ink. On the oldest sea charts, it sits west of Ireland, like a button sewn onto the ocean. With one tidy stitch, the island is shy about topography. No mountains, no bays, just the circle and the bar, as if the cartographer ran out of scenery and reached for geometry. Some copies place it a finger's width closer to Galway, some nudge it outward toward the Porcupine Bank, that underwater plateau with a name that sounds like a pub quiz team. The island's placement changed the way a nap does when you turn. The pillow. Not much, but you feel it. If you are still awake after this sentence, which is impressive, do feel free to subscribe for more very quiet circles. But please, only if your eyelids are on board. Hy-Brasil has been patient for 7 centuries. It can wait 2 more blinks. Medieval Portolan charts were practical creatures. Sailors liked them because the coasts looked like coasts, and the rem lines behaved as if the world could be navigated by spreadsheets. Compass roses bloomed across the vellum with just enough drama to keep a helmsman cheerful. In the margins, cartographers collected rumors the way cupboards collect spare buttons. Some rumors had dragons, some had saints. Hy-Brasil had excellent posture. Copyists in Majorca and Venice worked from each other like students borrowing lecture notes, and no one wanted to be the first person to remove a safe, round island only to meet it at sea the following summer and be judged by the horizon. One can almost hear the logic. Leave the circle. It costs so little ink and so much embarrassment if true. Sailors helped by seeing the sort of things that ocean produces when the atmosphere decides to improvise. There are reports of a flat smear of land that glided along the edge of sight, the color of wetted wool. One captain mentioned smoke, which is a persuasive detail because smoke implies kitchens and kitchens imply people who know where the cubs live. Another describes dogs barking, though the Atlantic is famous for shaping wind into convincing dogs, bells, and cousins. A few logs add small notes that feel like evidence even as they try not to be. Sea fowl very many, water discolored, swell altered, each of them little bureaucrats stamping a rumor with the ink of plausibility. My favorite is a crewman who claimed he could smell fresh turf, which is either proof of Ireland's generosity or the world's tidiest. Hallucination. The symbol itself, the circle and bar, became a kind of cartographic shrug that said, seen, by somebody, somewhere, sometime, which may be the most honest phrase a map has ever offered. Sometimes engravers split the circle, as if the island were two neat halves with a narrow channel the width of a well-behaved thought. A few labels multiplied as if vowels were trying on clothes. Hy-Brasil, Obrasil, Hy-Brasil. The spelling. You meant depended on which copyist had the freshest pen. What stayed consistent was the idea that a modest landmass lingered beyond the coast. Reliable in an unreliable way, like a neighbor who always waves but never gives their name. The stories told ashore were not grand, which is perhaps why they persisted. Hy-Brasil was said to be the land of eternal knowledge, a phrase that suggests thunder and revelation, but in the telling settled into something homelier. People return not with prophecies carved in glass, but with advice that fits in a pocket. There is a tale of a herdsman who learned to soothe a stubborn cow by humming a tune with no chorus. Another of a fisherman shown 3 knots, one for nets, one for a sleeve, and one for arguments. The island, it seems, specialized in knowledge. That would still be useful on a Tuesday when the stove is misbehaving. The rhythm of appearance mattered too. Some said Hy-Brasil rose from mist only every 7 years, a schedule that makes it sound like a baker's holiday. Others thought it surfaced at dawn when time prefers to whisper, or in that early afternoon lull when gulls drift like punctuation. There were hosts, of course, because every good island needs someone to offer tea. The people of Hy-Brasil, if people they were, rarely introduced themselves. They were polite to the point of being unhelpful. You may stay until the fog corrects itself, one is supposed to have said, which is both hospitable and a very island thing to say. Linking the place to the Celtic otherworld came naturally because the otherworld needs somewhere to keep its clean tablecloths. In Irish tradition, crossings happen when boundaries forget to be strict. At river fords, on ridge tops, in doorways, in weather that can't make up its mind. An island that attends only intermittently fits this policy. Some called Hy-Brasil a school. Others called it a rehearsal room. A few said saints visited to borrow silence. The details astonished by refusing to astonish. No gold, no roaring, no catastrophes. Just lessons about peat, nets, bread, and listening, which may be why the legend lives easily under a blanket. Such pleasant rumors eventually met people who enjoyed numbers. The 19th century loved measuring. Hydrographers went to sea with reels of wine, lead weights, paper for careful columns, and the serene belief that arithmetic has good manners. They sounded where Hy-Brasil should have stood and found water behaving like water. Admiralty charts began to use the word doubtful, a gently devastating adjective in government typography. Some lists went colder and filed it under non-existent, a category that always sounds one memo away from a promotion. Science offered an explanation, so tidy it felt like an apology to weather mirage. Specifically, Fata Morgana, a superior mirage named after a fairy who marketed graduate-level illusions. When warm air lies over cooler air, light bends downward, curving with the earth for a surprising distance as if taking a polite bow. Effect can stack distant coasts into little tiered cities, flip images upside down, and stretch a ship into a respectable tower. The West Irish Shelf, with its broad shallows and temperate inversions, sets the stage for this sort of theater. Kelp slicks darken the surface into convincing shorelines. Long swell trims them. Birds annotate the margin. If you already carry a chart that expects a round island, your mind supplies the missing courtesy. Expectation bias is the modern term, as if sailors were conducting psychological experiments with clipboards, but the sea has always known. The principle. You look for something, you find it politely, then a quarter hour later the edge dissolves, the city turns back into haze, and you realize reality has a reversible coat. None of this makes the watchers foolish. The horizon invites collaboration. Hy-Brasil feels, in many accounts, like a joint project between optics and patience. There were other technical suspects. The Porcupine Bank could push up unusual swells. KELP forests could tangle into temporary masses that behaved from a distance like confident land. Sounding errors happen. Charts are human, a stray point, a copied misprint, an adopted rumor that no one remembers adopting. A tidy irony sits here, the same conservative instinct that keeps a dangerous rock on maps for safety also kept a harmless phantom. The ocean is happiest when it can win both ways. As for the conspiracy, that strong modern word for what is often just a calendar Hy-Brasil, disappeared from maps when maps changed their job description. Medieval charts doubled as conversations. They had space for the maybe, the suggested, the cautionary flourish. A steamship captain with a timetable and an insurer preferred fewer flourishes. The telegraph disliked islands that mailed their own schedules. By the late 1800s, cartography became a list of certainties that could be sued. Hy-Brasil was excellent at uncertainty. It exited the office quietly. Some people prefer livelier exits. They speculate about hidden monastic communities practicing. Advanced fog, about smugglers who cultivated mirage to keep customs officers philosophical. About early cartographers winking across centuries like conspirators who can't resist inside jokes. Evidence for these notions is thinner than sea mist, and about as aggressive. Still, as bedtime company, they are pleasant. It is hard to be angry at an island that specializes in plausible deniability. What if it was real? Though real, as in gravel underfoot and socks unwilling to stay dry. There is room for a prosaic yes. Sand cays do lift, briefly, under kindnesses of wind and tide. Submerged ridges occasionally borrow the sunlight long enough to host a gathering of birds and reassurances. A volcanic knuckle far below could foster upwelling that grooms its own weather. A localized vale behaving suspiciously like architecture. A small platform of shingle might have shown itself at exceptional low waters and then gone modest again. For a human generation, if someone anchored on a slick, heard refracted breakers, and smelled kelp practicing chemistry, you could not blame them for writing home about a shore. The loveliest part of the legend, to me and I suspect to map makers, who spent years with rulers and whispers, is the curriculum. Eternal knowledge sounds impressive until you watch it wipe its feet. It teaches you to stack turf so the wind respects it, to read the posture of clouds at supper, to mend a net the way a sentence is mended, keeping meaning while removing drama. These are the sorts of facts that never trend and never fail. They do not shout. They do not expire. They live weatherproof lives in ordinary rooms. And when the island left the indexes, it stayed in the drawers. Archivists slide open flat cabinets, and there it is again, the circle with its one gentle bar, calm as if the Atlantic were a desk. The vellum smells faintly of thyme and sheep. The ink has browned into the color that makes all documents look truthful. Labels very Hy-Brasil, Hy-Brasil, as if the letters had slept and awakened slightly different. The more you stare, the more you feel the odd relief of a map that admits it once took guidance from rumor and does not mind being corrected. Even now, the sea enjoys reminding us. A photographer catches a superior mirage and publishes a skyline, built from air. Hikers see mountains hovering above lakes, patiently upside down as if practicing. Weather reports still use the term looming, which is both medieval and accurate. On some winter afternoons along the Irish coast, you may stand with your hands in your pockets and watch a dark smudge assemble itself out of discipline. Will look like land in the way a nap is not sleep and yet counts. You will consider the smallness of your certainty and find it comfortable, all of which brings us back to the bedtime virtue of Hy-Brasil. It is a legend that behaves like a well-made pillow, supportive, modest, and ready to accept the weight of your head without needing an opinion. It suggests that maps, even the serious ones, can have a fondness for the almost. It proposes that knowledge which endures is the sort that knows how to fix a hinge and recognize a storm by the fluster of small birds. It demonstrates, with the patience of a clerk, that vanishing from a list is not the same as not existing at all. So if your room has its own horizon, the edge of a curtain, perhaps, or the tidy line where a bookshelf meets shadow, try looking at it in a slow way. You may see a second edge appear for half a breath, a little stacked mirage courtesy of tired eyes and cooperative lamplight. You may catch a smudge that pretends to be a cape. Write a tiny log in your mind because sailors would approve. Observed. Land to the west, duration short, spirits agreeable. If in that moment, a store of useful peace arrives, the kind that teaches nothing dramatic and everything necessary, then Hy-Brasil has done its work without troubling the cartographers. And if the second edge drifts away before you finish, the sentence that is fine too. The island keeps excellent hours and is happy to wait while you drift into the quiet where all maps lead.